The death sentence exile. Su Ran was not a man who believed in second chances. As a legendary urban development director renowned for revitalizing bankrupt, decaying cities, he operated under a notoriously strict, uncompromising policy. Zero exceptions, zero renegotiations, and absolutely no returns on bad investments. He was a phantom in the corporate world, a mastermind who actively avoided the spotlight, preferring to orchestrate multi-billion-dollar infrastructure miracles entirely from the shadows of his office, rather than showing his face to the press. He died exactly as he lived, silently, ruthlessly efficiently, and strictly off-camera. At 40, his overworked heart simply gave out at his desk while he was auditing the supply chain of a failing industrial sector. When he opened his eyes again, he wasn't in a sterile hospital room. He was choking on a mouthful of coarse, biting sand. A violent, rattling cough tore through his chest, bringing the metallic taste of blood to his mouth. Su Ran forced his heavy eyelids open. Instead of the sleek glass and steel of his corner office, he was staring at a ceiling of rotting thatch and cracked mud. The air was freezing, carrying the suffocating scent of dry dust and absolute desolation. A flood of foreign, frantic memories crashed into his mind. He had transmigrated into a historical political novel, but he wasn't the heroic conqueror. He was the newly appointed magistrate of Yanyuan, a barren, cursed border town on the very edge of the northern desert. In the capital, Yanyuan was known simply as the grave of officials. It was a wasteland plagued by lethal sandstorms, infested with brutal desert bandits, and completely cut off from the empire's lucrative trade routes. The original Su Ran had been a naive, pampered scholar with a frail constitution who had foolishly offended the corrupt prime minister. His appointment to Yanyuan was a thinly veiled death sentence. The memories showed the original scholar arriving in the desert, taking one look at the starving populace, and immediately collapsing from sickness, weeping himself to death in sheer despair within his first month. Su Ran slowly sat up, his new, terrifyingly weak joints protesting. He looked down at his trembling, pale hands, then at the ragged blanket draped over his legs. He ran his fingers over the fabric. It was a crude, hand-loom cotton and rough wool blend. To the original pampered scholar, this scratchy fabric was a degrading insult. To the modern director who understood the value of raw materials, it was an uncatalogued textile asset, durable and possessing massive untapped commercial potential. Su Ran didn't weep. He didn't panic. He simply pushed the blanket aside and dragged his frail body out of the rickety bed. He walked to the shattered wooden window frame and looked out. The view was bleak. Endless expanses of gray dunes, dilapidated mud huts, and hollow-eyed, starving citizens huddled against the biting wind. Su Ran picked up a cracked clay cup from the table and took a slow sip of lukewarm, gritty water. His analytical mind was already running a merciless diagnostic on the town. Zero infrastructure, catastrophic water scarcity, high security risk, and a completely unregulated, uncatalogued labor force, Su Ran murmured, his voice raspy but vibrating with an undeniable, chilling authority. He turned away from the window, walked over to a splintered desk, and pulled a fresh, cheap sheet of parchment toward him. He dipped a dry brush into a half-empty inkstone. The original scholar had written poems of sorrow here. Su Ran began to draft a centralized municipal ledger. "A town that the Empire has completely abandoned," Su Ran whispered, a predatory, calculating gleam lighting up his dark eyes. He drew a sharp, decisive line down the center of the parchment, establishing his absolute, unyielding operational laws for this new enterprise. A perfect blank canvas. Let's build a tax haven. Phase 1. Microloans, mud huts, and the Iron General. The air in Yanyuan didn't just smell like dust, it smelled like despair. The local populace was composed of broken exiles and starving farmers desperately trying to coax millet out of dead sandy soil. They were heavily taxed by the previous magistrates, leaving them with nothing but skin and bones. Su Ran realized immediately that trying to farm the desert was a catastrophic misallocation of resources. He needed an industrial revolution, and he needed it before winter. Despite his frail, sickly new body, which routinely betrayed him with violent coughing fits, Su Ran set up his office not in the magistrate's comfortable manner, but right in the center of the dusty town square. He started by halting all traditional agricultural taxes, sending a shockwave through the town. Then he introduced a concept entirely alien to the ancient feudal system, microfinance. Using the very last of his personal silver from the capital, Su Ran established the Yanyuan Development Fund. He called forward the town's most marginalized citizens, the elderly weavers and the widowed women. "I am not giving you charity, and I am not a loan shark," Su Ran explained to a trembling, calloused woman named Auntie May, pressing a small pouch of silver into her hands. "This is an interest-free capital injection. Use this to buy raw wool from the nomadic tribes across the border. When you sell the finished product, you pay the principal back into the fund so your neighbor can borrow it next." To maximize efficiency, Su Ran didn't let them work individually. He reorganized the town's labor force, establishing a rudimentary assembly line. Some women only washed the wool, some only spun, and others only wove. By specializing their labor, their output skyrocketed. Within weeks, Yanyuan was mass-producing heavy, high-grade, wind-resistant desert cloaks. But cloaks wouldn't solve the water crisis. For that, Su Ran went to the blacksmiths. It was high noon, and the heat inside the central forge was unbearable. Su Ran, his pale face flushed, and a handkerchief pressed to his mouth to block the soot, was meticulously drawing the blueprints for a modern, high-efficiency piston water pump on a piece of scraped leather. He was in the middle of explaining the standardization of iron gears to a group of bewildered, awestruck blacksmiths when the heavy wooden doors of the forge were violently kicked open. The blazing desert sun silhouetted a terrifying figure. It was Huo Changge, the lone wolf of the north, and the supreme general of the Iron Vanguard garrison. He was a mountain of a man, clad in heavily scarred dark armor, his broad shoulders blocking out the light. He carried the scent of horse sweat, desert wind, and dried blood. Huo Changge despised capital scholars. To him, they were pampered, corrupt parasites who embezzled military funds and treated the border towns like their personal playgrounds. Hearing that the new, delicate magistrate had canceled the military grain taxes, Huo Changge had ridden for 2 days straight, absolutely furious. The general marched into the forge, the blacksmith scattering in terror. He slammed his massive, notched broadsword flat onto the anvil, right next to Su Ran's delicate blueprints. The metal rang with a deafening screech. "Magistrate Su!" Huo Changge's voice was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated in the small room. He leaned in, his dark, predatory eyes locked onto Su Ran's pale face. "I heard you canceled the grain taxes. My garrison relies on those taxes for winter rations. If my men starve because of some foolish, soft-handed scholar's idealism, I will personally drag you into the dunes and feed you to the wolves." Su Ran didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He didn't even look at the terrifying sword. Instead, Su Ran calmly picked up his handkerchief, wiped a smudge of charcoal from his fingers, and finally looked up, meeting the fearsome general's gaze with the icy, unbothered authority of a CEO dealing with a highly emotional department head. "General Huo," Su Ran said, his voice perfectly smooth, "those grain taxes amounted to barely 300 bags of moldy millet a year. It costs you more calories to transport it than it does to eat it. Your men are starving because you are treating a massive logistics problem like a martial one." Huo Changge's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You dare lecture me on war, little scholar?" "I am lecturing you on supply chains," Su Ran corrected sharply. He reached into his wide sleeve and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, slapping it down on the anvil right on top of Huo Changge's sword. "Look at this." Huo Changge frowned, glancing down at the immaculate, incredibly complex columns of numbers. "I have just negotiated a trade monopoly with the 3 largest nomadic tribes across the border," Su Ran explained, tapping the page with a slender finger. "They have meat, but they freeze in the winter and lack fresh water. We have just manufactured a surplus of heavy wool cloaks and these new iron water pumps. In exchange for our goods, they are delivering 10,000 head of prime livestock to your garrison's gates by next Tuesday." The silence in the forge was absolute, save for the crackling of the fire. "I don't need your pathetic millet taxes, General," Su Ran continued, stepping closer to the towering warrior, entirely unafraid. "I need your elite cavalry to secure my new trade caravans from the desert bandits. I feed your army premium beef and mutton all winter, and in return, you become the physical muscle for my trade zone. Do we have a deal, or would you prefer to go back to eating sand and mold?" Huo Changge stared at the ledger. 10,000 head of livestock. It was a logistical miracle that the Ministry of Revenue hadn't been able to achieve in a decade, and this fragile, coughing scholar had orchestrated it in 3 weeks using nothing but mud huts and local weavers. Slowly, Huo Changge looked away from the ledger and down at Su Ran. The disdain in the general's eyes completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sharp, burning intrigue and a profound, reluctant respect. With a slow, deliberate movement, Huo Changge slid his broadsword out from under the ledger and sheathed it with a heavy clack. 10,000 head by Tuesday, Magistrate Su, Huo Changge rumbled, the corner of his scarred mouth twitching upward into a dangerous feral smile. "If a single sheep is missing, I'll hold you personally accountable. But if you deliver, the Iron Vanguard is yours to command." Phase 2. Weaponizing the Free Trade Zone. The alliance between the frail magistrate and the terrifying general was forged in iron and silver, and its results were instantaneous. General Huo Changge was a man of his word. With his supply lines overflowing with premium beef and mutton, his elite cavalry rode out into the desert with terrifying zeal. Within a month, the notorious Black Sand Bandits, a scourge that had plagued the northern routes for a century, were entirely eradicated. Huo Changge personally brought the bandit leader's severed head back to Yanyuan, tossing it onto the courtyard stones as proof that the trade routes were secure. But when the blood-soaked general walked into the town square, he stopped dead in his tracks. Yanyuan was no longer a graveyard of mud huts. Su Ran had initiated a massive, ruthless urbanization project. The young magistrate had established a streamlined customs house at the town's entrance. In an era where merchants were accustomed to being squeezed for arbitrary bribes by corrupt border officials, Su Ran implemented a flat, transparent 2% tariff. No bribes, no delays, no haggling. "Time is money, gentlemen," Su Ran announced smoothly to a stunned caravan of Persian silk merchants, stamping their transit papers with rapid, efficient precision. "Under the protection of General Huo's Iron Vanguard, your goods are insured. If a single bolt of silk is stolen within my territory, the Yanyuan Development Fund will reimburse you at market value. Welcome to the Free Trade Zone." Word of the incorruptible magistrate and the invincible general spread across the Silk Road like wildfire. Merchants from India, the Central Plains, and the Western deserts bypassed the heavily taxed capital routes entirely, flooding Yanyuan with exotic spices, raw silver, and untold wealth. With the massive influx of capital, Su Ran built paved stone roads that cut travel time in half. He funded the construction of flowing aqueducts that turned the arid soil into lush, irrigated terraces. But as the dusty town transformed into a glittering jewel of commerce, the most profound transformation happened behind the closed doors of the magistrate's manor. Huo Changge, a man who had spent his entire adult life sleeping in cold tents and brooding over maps of war, found himself incapable of staying away from Su Ran. The terrifying lone wolf of the north practically moved into the magistrate's study. It was late autumn, and the desert nights were growing brutally cold. Su Ran's frail original body was not built for the harsh climate. He was huddled over a massive, incredibly detailed blueprint of a new silver depository. A thick fur blanket wrapped around his shaking shoulders, coughing softly into a silk handkerchief. The heavy wooden doors clicked open, and the freezing draft was instantly blocked by Huo Changge's massive frame. The general had just returned from a 3-day border patrol. He smelled of horse sweat, cold iron, and the biting winter wind, but his eyes softened the moment they landed on the shivering scholar. Without a word, Huo Changge shed his heavy, frost-covered armor at the door. He walked over to the brazier, expertly stoking the coals until the room glowed with heat. Then he approached the desk, carrying a small, steaming plate. "You haven't slept," Huo Changge rumbled, his deep voice carrying a note of gruff reprimand that failed to hide his intense worry. He set the plate down right over Su Ran's ledger. It was roasted sweet melon drizzled with honey, an incredibly rare, expensive luxury in the north. "The quarterly GDP report is due," Su Ran sighed, though he didn't protest as the general's large, incredibly warm hands settled onto his tense, aching shoulders. Huo Changge began to massage the knots at the base of Su Ran's neck, his callous thumbs working with surprising, tender precision. He subtly channeled his own inner martial qi into the scholar's body, chasing the bone-deep chill from Su Ran's frail limbs. Su Ran let his eyes flutter shut, leaning back against the immovable, rock-solid warmth of the general's chest. He let out a soft, contented hum. For a man who had spent his previous life dying of a heart attack in an empty, sterile corporate office, this level of care was utterly intoxicating. Huo Changge looked down at the brilliant, breathtaking man leaning against him. The general's heart clenched with a terrifying, overwhelming emotion. He looked at his own hands, scarred, rough, built only for slaughter, and then at Su Ran's slender, ink-stained fingers that were currently holding the wealth of an entire region. "You turned a wasteland into a paradise, Ranner," Huo Changge whispered, the intimate endearment slipping out before he could stop it. His voice was thick with a fierce, burning devotion, tinged with a heavy vulnerability. "The capital is full of fools. They threw you away, and my hands only know how to kill. I don't deserve to stand in your light." Su Ran's eyes snapped open. The corporate executive in him immediately recognized a severe undervaluation of assets. He spun around in his chair, ignoring the ledgers entirely. Su Ran reached up, grabbing the lapels of Huo Changge's dark tunic, and pulled the towering warrior down to his eye level. "Never devalue your worth in my presence, Huo Changge," Su Ran said, his gaze sharp, entirely unbothered by the general's lethal reputation. "I am just a man with an abacus. Without your sword, my wealth is just a target. You protect the borders, I manage the capital. We hold equal shares in this enterprise. It is a perfectly balanced merger." Huo Changge's breath caught in his throat. The raw, unapologetic acceptance in Su Ran's eyes shattered the last of his defenses. With a low, desperate growl, Huo Changge dropped to his knees beside the chair, wrapping his massive arms around Su Ran's waist. He buried his face in the soft silk of the magistrate's robes, breathing in the scent of ink and expensive tea. Su Ran smiled, a genuine, warm smile that had nothing to do with profit margins. He threaded his fingers through the general's dark, windswept hair. Huo Changge tilted his head up, his dark eyes burning with absolute surrender. He reached up, cupping Su Ran's pale cheek with terrifying gentleness, and pulled him down into a deep, consuming kiss. It tasted of honey, desert wind, and a possessive, unbreakable vow. Whoever dares threaten this man will face the wrath of the entire Northern Army. Phase 3, the Siege of Silver and the Corporate Blockade. The staggering, unprecedented wealth flowing through Yanyuan did exactly what Su Ran predicted it would. It painted a massive target on their backs. The corrupt Imperial Court in the capital was bankrupt, bloated, and desperate. When reports reached the Prime Minister that the grave of officials had transformed into a glittering oasis, flowing with Persian silver and Indian silk, greed immediately took over. The Prime Minister easily manipulated the paranoid emperor, branding Su Ran's free trade zone as an act of treason and a precursor to rebellion. The imperial decree was swift and merciless. A massive army of 100,000 imperial troops was dispatched to march north, ordered to seize Yanyuan's treasury, slaughter the garrison, and bring Su Ran back to the capital in an iron cage. News of the approaching army arrived via a bloodied scout just as the first winter snow began to fall. Inside the magistrate's brightly lit study, the atmosphere was thick with lethal tension. Huo Changge stood over a large topographical map, fully armored, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked carved from granite. His iron vanguard only numbered 20,000 men. "They outnumber us 5-1, Huo Changge stated, his voice a grim, heavy rumble. He didn't look at the map. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on Su Ran, who was calmly sipping hot tea at his desk. "The Imperial vanguard is heavily armored. If it comes to a siege, Our walls will hold for a month, but we will eventually be overrun. Huo Changge crossed the room, dropping to one knee beside Su Ran's chair. He took the scholar's delicate hands in his massive gauntleted ones. I have arranged a fast carriage and an elite escort, the general said softly, his thumbs tracing the knuckles of the man he loved. I want you to leave tonight, Ranner. Head west, into the desert tribe's territory. I will hold the gates of Yanyuan until my last breath. I will buy you enough time to disappear. Su Ran looked down at the fearsome, undefeated god of war, who was literally offering to die just to secure his safe passage. Su Ran felt a sharp ache in his chest, a profound, unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with profit margins. He gently pulled his hands free, reached up, and cupped Huo Changge's rough, battle-scarred face. I did not build a multi-million silver trade empire just to abandon it to a hostile takeover, Changge, Su Ran said, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy whisper. And I certainly did not authorize you to die. War is not a test of courage. It is simply an expensive business transaction. Su Ran stood up, his sweeping silk robes trailing behind him as he walked to the map. He picked up a red calligraphy brush. They have 100,000 men, Su Ran said, a predatory, terrifying smile curving his lips. Do you know how many calories 100,000 men consume a day while marching through winter terrain? They have the manpower, General, but we control the liquidity. We are going to starve them out before they even see our walls. Instead of mobilizing troops, Su Ran mobilized his merchants. He launched a flawless, three-pronged economic blockade. Shorting the supply chain, Su Ran dispatched his shadow brokers south, armed with chests of solid silver. They systematically visited every major grain merchant and farming commune along the Imperial Army's march route. Su Ran didn't just buy the grain, he bought the futures on the grain at double the market price, provided the merchants transported it directly to Yanyuan. When the Imperial quartermasters arrived to buy supplies, the granaries were entirely empty. Currency weaponization. The Imperial Army was funded by the Emperor's heavily debased copper and gold coins. Su Ran issued a decree across the Silk Road. Yanyuan banks and its affiliated merchants would no longer accept imperial currency. They demanded only Yanyuan stamped silver ingots. Overnight, the Imperial Army's war chest became worthless paper and cheap metal. The few merchants who did have food refused to sell to the marching soldiers, knowing the Emperor's money was useless on the open market. The hostile bounty. As a final lethal blow, Su Ran used his trade surplus to place a massive, public silver bounty on the heads of the corrupt imperial generals. He had his spies scatter pamphlets throughout the enemy camps. Any soldier who surrenders to Yanyuan will receive land and 20 tiles of silver. Any soldier who brings the head of their commanding officer will receive 1,000. For 3 weeks, the Imperial Army marched through the freezing barren plains. They found no food, no forage, and merchants who laughed at their worthless coins. By the time the 100,000-strong force finally reached the valley outside Yanyuan, it was not an army. It was a freezing, starving, demoralized mob. Mutinies had already broken out in the rear ranks over a single loaf of bread. The heavy iron gates of Yanyuan slowly groaned open. Huo Changge rode out at the head of his 20,000 elite Iron Vanguard troops. His men were heavily armored, their horses well rested, their bodies fueled by premium winter rations. Behind them, standing high on the stone battlements in a sweeping fox fur cloak, was Su Ran, watching the ledger balance itself out. The imperial commander, a pampered nobleman from the capital, drew his sword with a trembling hand, screaming for his men to charge. Not a single soldier moved. Huo Changge slowly raised his massive broadsword, the cold steel catching the winter sun. He didn't order an attack. He simply pointed the blade toward a line of massive steaming cauldrons set up just outside the city walls, where Yanyuan cooks were boiling fragrant, thick meat porridge. "Drop your weapons," Huo Changge's voice boomed across the valley, carrying the absolute authority of the north, "and you eat today." The clatter of 100,000 swords, spears, and shields hitting the frozen ground was deafening. The siege was over without a single drop of blood being spilled. The imperial commander was swiftly tied up by his own starving men and traded for a bowl of porridge and a pouch of silver. Huo Changge looked up at the battlements, his chest heaving, his heart swelling with an awe so profound it bordered on worship. His brilliant, beautiful scholar hadn't just won a war, he had utterly humiliated the heavens. Epilogue. Dividends of a new dynasty. The transformation of Yan Yuan from a grave of officials to the sovereign state of the North was not achieved through blood, but through the precise, cold, and undeniable logic of infrastructure. The Imperial Court, crippled by the catastrophic failure of their siege and the subsequent economic collapse of the southern trade routes, had no choice but to recognize Yan Yuan's sovereignty. They begged for trade access, they groveled for grain, and they sent endless, desperate letters requesting the re-establishment of order. Su Ran, now sitting as the sovereign of the Silk Road, treated these letters with the same dismissive efficiency he once applied to spam emails in his past life. He organized them into a filing cabinet marked Waste Disposal, the Dual Ascension. On the day of the formal coronation, the ceremony was markedly different from the opulent, hollow rituals of the capital. There were no gilded palanquins or sacrificial rites. Instead, the entire region, merchants from the east, tribes from the west, and the soldiers of the Iron Vanguard, gathered in the massive open-air plaza of the newly renovated Yanyuan Citadel. The architecture was a fusion of desert resilience and Central Plains elegance, white desert jade etched with intricate ironwork. When Su Ran walked up the central stairs, he did not walk alone. He was clad in robes of deep indigo and gold, his posture relaxed, his eyes carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had successfully optimized his entire reality. Walking stride for stride beside him was Huo Changge, no longer wearing the blood-stained armor of a war general, but the ceremonial, silver-trimmed regalia of a co-sovereign. The crown was not placed on Su Ran's head by a priest. He and Huo Changge placed the circlets upon each other, a mutual silent vow that they were not rulers over the people, but the architects of their prosperity. The evolution of the lone wolf. The most striking change, however, was not in the city, but in the men themselves. General Huo Changge had once been known as the Lone Wolf, a man who believed his only purpose was to bleed for an empire that didn't care if he lived or died. But sitting on the throne of Yan Yuan, the wolf had been thoroughly tamed by the warmth of a life he had never dared to imagine. He no longer spent his nights checking the sharpness of his blade. Instead, he spent them meticulously learning the nuances of trade law, purely so he could better support Su Ran's grand logistical visions. He had traded his solitary, violent existence for a life of shared purpose, realizing that his greatest strength wasn't his sword, but the person who made him want to lay it down. Su Ran, too, had been fundamentally altered. The man who had been a cold, corporate machine, driven solely by the metrics of success, had found his humanity in the harsh desert. He had learned that the highest return on investment was not wealth, but time. He no longer obsessively tracked his work-life balance. He had finally achieved it. The perfect balance. That evening, after the celebrations had quieted, the two men retreated to the private inner sanctum of the citadel. The room was warm, filled with the scent of desert jasmine and burning beeswax candles. Su Ran was at his desk, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't drafting a ledger. He was watching the firelight dance across the room. Huo Changge approached him, his movements heavy and deliberate. He pulled Su Ran up from the chair and simply held him, pressing his face into the curve of Su Ran's neck. The general didn't need to speak. The way he held Su Ran was a testament to everything they had built together, a sanctuary in the middle of a once barren waste. "The ledgers are closed, Ranner," Huo Changge whispered against his skin, his voice a low, vibrating hum of pure contentment. Su Ran turned in his arms, his eyes softening as he looked at the man who had been his guardian, his partner, and his anchor. He realized then that the empire they had built, the roads, the aqueducts, the thriving markets, were merely the backdrop. The true profit, the real dividend, was this: the quiet, absolute certainty of waking up tomorrow in the arms of the man who knew the worth of his soul. Then let's retire, Su Ran replied, his voice barely a breath. The empire can balance itself until morning. And in the silence of the desert night, the sovereign and his general finally found the one thing money could never buy. A world where their only priority was each other.